I remember the weight of that evening like it happened yesterday, though years have passed since I sat in that train car, watching the darkness slide past the windows. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with the rhythm of the tracks beneath us, casting everything in that harsh, unforgiving glow that makes strangers look like ghosts. I had chosen a seat near the back, away from the handful of other passengers making their way home from the city, their faces buried in phones or pressed against windows, lost in their own private worlds. My shirt was still pressed from the morning, though the day had left its mark in small wrinkles around my collar. I smoothed it absently, a habit Clara had always teased me about. My wedding band caught the light as I adjusted my cufflinks, that familiar weight on my finger that had become as unconscious as breathing. 23 years of marriage, and I still twisted it when I was nervous, still felt its presence like a reminder of who I was supposed to be. That's when he got on. I noticed him immediately, though I told myself I didn't. He moved with an ease that seemed foreign to me, settling into a seat across the aisle with the kind of casual confidence I had spent decades learning to suppress. He was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he didn't spend his mornings wrestling it into submission like I did. His clothes were simple but deliberate, a worn leather jacket over a plain t-shirt that somehow looked more authentic than my carefully chosen business attire. He was laughing, not at anything in particular, just a low, genuine sound that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside him. It was the kind of laughter I remembered from before, from a version of myself I had buried so completely that hearing it from someone else felt like hearing a forgotten language. The train swayed, and I gripped the armrest, watching him from the corner of my eye. He seemed untouched by the anxiety that lived permanently in my chest, that constant awareness of how I sat, how I looked, whether anyone might notice something in me that I worked so hard to hide. He simply existed, taking up space without apology, and I found myself both envious and terrified of that freedom. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that seemed to see past the careful mask I wore everywhere I went. He smiled, not the polite, distant smile of strangers on public transport, but something warmer, more knowing. I felt my face flush and looked down at my hands, at the wedding ring that suddenly felt too tight. When I looked up again, he was still watching me. He leaned forward slightly, and I could smell his cologne, something clean and understated that mixed with the stale air of the train car. His voice was low when he spoke, just loud enough for me to hear over the clatter of the rails. He told me he wasn't wearing anything under his jacket, said it like it was a secret we were sharing, like he was letting me in on something private and dangerous. Then, before I could process what was happening, before I could retreat behind the wall of propriety I had spent my entire adult life constructing, he stood up and moved to the seat beside me. The space between us disappeared, replaced by the warmth of his presence, the sound of his breathing, the impossible reality that someone like him was choosing to sit next to someone like me. My entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing as if preparing for impact. Part of me wanted to stand up, to move away, to restore the safe distance that kept my world intact. But another part of me, a part one had been suffocating for so long I had almost forgotten it existed, wanted to lean closer. I could feel my hand trembling slightly as I touched my wedding ring, turning it around my finger in that nervous gesture that had become second nature. The metal felt cold against my skin, a reminder of the life waiting for me at the end of this train ride. The house where Clara would be setting the table for dinner, where normalcy and expectation wrapped around me like a familiar coat. But sitting there, feeling the heat radiating from this stranger beside me, I felt something crack open inside my chest. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing, for the first time, that jumping might not mean falling. It might mean flying. The train continued its journey through the darkness, carrying me toward home, toward the life I had built so carefully, so completely. But something had shifted in those few moments, something I couldn't take back or pretend hadn't happened. A door had opened, just a crack, but enough to let in a sliver of light that would change everything. The train pulled into my station with that familiar screech of brakes that had marked the end of my workdays for the past 15 years. I walked the 6 blocks home through streets I could navigate blindfolded, past the same mailboxes and carefully maintained lawns, past Mrs. Henderson watering her roses and the Johnsons' dog barking from behind their fence. Everything exactly as it should be, exactly as it always was. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial with shutters that Clara insisted we repaint every 3 years. White with forest green trim, a color combination she had chosen from a magazine and declared perfect for our family. I had agreed, as I agreed to most things, because keeping peace was easier than expressing preferences I wasn't sure I had anymore. The front porch light was already on, casting its warm yellow glow across the welcome mat that read, "The Hart Family," in cheerful script. I could see Clara moving through the kitchen window, her silhouette familiar after all these years, the same graceful efficiency she brought to everything she did. She was a good woman, Clara. She deserved more than I had given her, though I couldn't name exactly what that something more might be. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary, my key already in my hand, watching my own life unfold behind those lit windows. Sometimes I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines, going through the motions of a role I had never auditioned for but somehow landed anyway. The man who came home at 6:15, who asked about dinner and sorted through the mail and discussed weekend plans over coffee that had grown cold while we talked about everything except what mattered. The front door opened into the hallway where Clara had hung family photos in carefully arranged clusters. Our wedding day, both of us so young and certain. The kids as babies, then toddlers, then awkward teenagers with braces and forced smiles. Vacations to places we thought we should visit, moments captured and framed as evidence of a happy life. I straightened one of the frames automatically, a habit Clara had learned to ignore. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel that matched the curtains. Her hair was shorter now than when we married, styled in a way that was practical rather than romantic, though she was still beautiful in that quiet, understated way that had first attracted me. She smiled when she saw me, the same smile she had given me yesterday and would give me tomorrow, warm but somehow distant, like looking at someone through glass. We made our usual small talk over dinner. "How was your day?" "Fine, how was yours?" The Petersons' dog got loose again. Traffic was terrible on Route 9. Our son Michael called from college, needed money for textbooks. Our daughter Sarah had made varsity soccer, which meant more driving to games on weekends. Normal things, safe things, the kind of conversations that filled space without revealing anything important. I found myself studying Clara's face as she talked, wondering when we had stopped really seeing each other. She was telling me about her book club, how Mrs. Patterson had insisted they read something called 50 Shades, and how scandalized everyone pretended to be. She laughed, and I smiled at the appropriate moments, but I felt like I was watching her through a thick pane of glass. Present but not really there, going through the motions of intimacy without any of its substance. After dinner, I retreated to my study, a small room off the living room that Clara had let me claim as my own space. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but most of the volumes were the ones I thought I should own rather than the ones I actually wanted to read. Biographies of presidents and business leaders, books about golf and investing, the kind of titles that looked respectable when colleagues visited. Hidden behind them, tucked away where no one would think to look, were the books that actually mattered to me. Poetry by writers whose names I was afraid to say out loud. Novels about men who loved other men. Stories of lives lived honestly even when honesty came at a terrible cost. I pulled out one of these hidden books, something I had bought months ago and never had the courage to read. The pages felt dangerous in my hands, like holding evidence of a crime I hadn't yet committed but was always thinking about. I read a few pages, about 2 men meeting in a coffee shop, about the electricity that passed between them when their hands accidentally touched, and I had to put it down. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow, as if the walls of my carefully constructed life were closing in. Clara called good night from the hallway. her slippers making that soft shuffling sound they always made against the hardwood floors. I called back, my voice steady and normal, the voice of a husband saying good night to his wife after another ordinary day. But inside, I felt anything but ordinary. The encounter on the train had stirred something I had worked so hard to keep buried, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to push it back down again. I sat in my chair until well past midnight, listening to the house settle around me, to the familiar sounds of a life I had built but never quite learned to inhabit. Somewhere above me, Clara was sleeping alone in our bed, as she had been for months without either of us acknowledging it. Somewhere in the city, the man from the train was probably living his life with an authenticity I couldn't imagine, unafraid of who he was or what he wanted. And somewhere inside me, in a place I had locked away so completely I had almost forgotten it existed, something was beginning to wake up. 3 weeks passed before I saw him again. 3 weeks of riding the same train, sitting in the same seats, watching the same faces drift in and out of the car like ghosts in my peripheral vision. I told myself I wasn't looking for him, that the flutter of disappointment I felt each evening when the doors closed without him stepping through was nothing more than idle curiosity. But I knew I was lying, the same way I had been lying to myself about so many things for so long that deception had become a second language. It was a Thursday evening, later than usual. I had stayed at the office to finish a report that could have waited until morning, but going home had felt impossible somehow. The weight of another dinner conversation about nothing, another evening of pretending to read while my mind wandered to places I couldn't let it go. So I worked until the cleaning crew arrived, until the building grew quiet around me, until I had no choice but to face the journey home. The train was nearly empty when I boarded, just a few scattered passengers lost in their own worlds. I had almost settled into my usual routine of staring out the window at the darkness when I heard his voice. He said my name, Julian. He said it like he had been thinking about it, like he had been carrying it around with him since that night weeks ago. I turned, and there he was, standing in the aisle with that same easy confidence, but different somehow. Quieter, more serious. The playful energy from our first encounter had been replaced by something deeper, something that made my chest tighten with recognition. He asked if he could sit, and I nodded because speech seemed impossible. This time when he settled beside me, there was no teasing, no dangerous whispers. Just his presence, solid and warm and somehow familiar, as if I had been waiting for him without knowing it. He told me his name was Elias, said it simply, like an offering, and I repeated it silently in my mind, testing how it felt. Elias. It suited him, this man who seemed to carry lightness with him wherever he went, who made the cramped train car feel like somewhere I actually wanted to be. We talked, and talking with him was unlike anything I had experienced in years. He asked me about music, about what I listened to when no one else was around, and somehow I found myself telling him about the jazz records I kept hidden in my office desk, the ones Clara would find too melancholy, too strange. He nodded like he understood, like he had his own collection of hidden things, his own secret preferences he couldn't share with the world. The conversation meandered the way good conversations do, touching on books and movies and the weight of living up to other people's expectations. He told me about growing up in a family that loved him but never quite understood him, about learning to be careful with his truth, about the exhaustion that came from editing himself for other people's comfort. When he spoke, I saw myself reflected in his words, saw the careful performance I had been giving my entire adult life. He was perceptive in a way that should have frightened me, but somehow didn't. He seemed to see through the careful facade I presented to the world, past the pressed shirts and perfect manners, straight to something real and raw that I had been hiding even from myself. When he looked at me, I felt exposed but not judged, seen but not condemned. The train moved through the darkness, and I found myself hoping the journey would last longer, that whatever force controlled the movement of trains and the passage of time might slow down just for this moment. Elias had a way of making silence comfortable, of letting conversation flow naturally without forcing it, and I felt myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in years. He asked me about loneliness, about whether I ever felt like I was living someone else's life. The question hit me like a physical blow, so accurate it took my breath away. I wanted to deflect, to give him the safe answer, to retreat behind the wall of propriety that usually protected me from such direct inquiry. Instead, I found myself nodding, admitting to this near stranger what I had never admitted to anyone, not even myself. He didn't push, didn't demand more than I was ready to give. He just listened with the kind of attention that felt like acceptance, like whatever I might say would be met with understanding rather than judgment. It was a generosity I wasn't used to, and I felt something inside me begin to unfurl, like a plant that had been kept in darkness finally reaching toward light. The train began to slow as we approached my station, and panic seized me. I wasn't ready for this conversation to end, wasn't ready to return to the careful choreography of my evening routine. Elias seemed to sense my reluctance, and when he asked if we might continue talking sometime, I heard myself saying yes before my rational mind could intervene. We exchanged numbers, a simple transaction that felt momentous. I saved his contact information carefully, like I was handling something precious and fragile. When I looked up, he was watching me with that same direct gaze that made me feel simultaneously terrified and alive. The train stopped, and I had to leave. I walked home through the familiar streets, but everything looked different somehow, like I was seeing my neighborhood through new eyes. The careful lawns and matching mailboxes that had always felt comforting now seemed suffocating, like evidence of a life lived by committee rather than choice. I arrived home to find Clara in the kitchen, setting the table with our everyday dishes, the ones we had received as a wedding gift and had been using for over 2 decades. She smiled when she saw me, asked about my day, began recounting the small dramas of her own afternoon. I responded appropriately, made the right sounds of interest and concern, but I felt like I was watching the scene from somewhere far away. During dinner, the silence between us felt different. Not companionable, as I had always told myself, but heavy with things unsaid, with a lifetime of careful conversations that had never touched on anything that mattered. Clara talked about weekend plans, about a dinner party the Thompsons were hosting, about whether we needed to replace the washing machine. Normal things, practical things, the kind of details that filled a marriage but never quite captured its essence. I found myself thinking about Elias, about the way he had listened to me, really listened, without trying to fix or change or redirect me. About how easy it had been to talk to him, how natural it felt to say things I had never said to anyone. The contrast with my marriage was stark and painful, and I felt guilt settle over me like a familiar coat. That night, lying in bed beside Clara, I stared at the ceiling and listened to her breathing, to the sound of someone I had shared a bed with for over 20 years, but who felt like a stranger. Something fundamental had shifted during that train ride. Something I couldn't name or understand, but could feel moving through me like a tide I couldn't stop. Whatever I had been protecting myself from all these years, whatever I had been so afraid of becoming, it was stirring to life despite my best efforts to keep it buried. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't sure I wanted to fight it anymore. What began as chance encounters became something more deliberate, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. The second time we met was at a coffee shop near my office, a place I had mentioned during our train conversation. He was there when I arrived, sitting by the window with a book I didn't recognize, and when he looked up and smiled, I felt that same flutter of recognition that had become both familiar and terrifying. He asked if I wanted to join him, and I did, telling myself it was just politeness, just two people sharing coffee and conversation. But as we talked, I found myself leaning forward, drawn into his orbit in a way that felt both natural and dangerous. He told me about his work as a freelance graphic designer, about clients who wanted him to make their vision come alive without giving him the freedom to actually create. I told him about my job at the insurance company, about spreadsheets and actuarial tables, and the quiet desperation of middle management. When I laughed at something he said, really laughed for the first time in months, he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with such intensity that I felt heat rise in my cheeks. He said I should do that more often, that I had a good laugh, and I found myself smiling like a teenager who had just been complimented by someone they admired. The coffee stretched into an early dinner at a small restaurant neither of us had planned to visit. Then a walk through streets I had never explored, even though I had worked in this city for 15 years. With Elias, everything felt new somehow, like I was seeing the world through different eyes. He pointed out details I had never noticed, the way light fell across building facades, the sound of evening traffic creating its own kind of music, the small dramas playing out in lit windows above us. Time felt different when I was with him. Not the rushed, compartmentalized time of my normal life, where every moment was scheduled and purposeful, but something more fluid, more forgiving. Hours could pass without me noticing, and when I finally checked my watch, I was always surprised by how late it had gotten, how far we had walked, how much we had talked about without seeming to talk about anything important at all. I started staying late at the office more often, not to work, but to meet him afterward. I told Clara I was dealing with a difficult client, a complicated project that required extra attention. The lies came easily, which should have bothered me more than it did. But when I was with Elias, guilt felt like something that belonged to someone else, to the version of myself I left behind when I walked out of my office building and into whatever adventure he had planned for us. He had a way of making ordinary things feel extraordinary. A sandwich from a food truck became a feast when we ate it sitting on a park bench, talking about books we had loved as children. A late-night walk along the river became an exploration of possibility, of what life might look like if we had the courage to live it honestly. He told me about places he had traveled, people he had met, experiences I couldn't imagine having but found myself wanting nonetheless. It was during one of these walks, maybe our 6th or 7th meeting, that he began to reveal the spaces behind his easy confidence. He told me about Marcus, a man he had loved and lost to someone more stable, more conventional. About his parents, who loved him but still introduced him to neighbors as their son who worked in computers rather than their son who was gay. About the exhaustion of performing normalcy for people who would never fully accept the truth of who he was. His vulnerability made him more beautiful, not less. When he talked about loneliness, about the weight of hiding parts of himself from people who claimed to love him, I saw my own reflection in his words. We were different kinds of wounded, perhaps, but wounded nonetheless, both carrying secrets that shaped how we moved through the world. I found myself sharing things I had never told anyone. About the books I hid behind other books, about the dreams I had stopped letting myself have, about the feeling that I was living someone else's life and had forgotten how to find my way back to my own. He listened without trying to fix me, without offering solutions or advice, just witnessing whatever I needed to say with the kind of attention that felt like grace. The changes in me weren't lost on Clara. She asked why I had been working so late so often, whether everything was all right at the office. I assured her it was temporary, that things would return to normal soon, but I could see the concern in her eyes, the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. Michael called from college and asked why I seemed distracted during our phone conversations, whether I was getting enough sleep. Even Sarah, usually too absorbed in her own teenage drama to notice parental moods, commented that I seemed different somehow. The guilt was real, a constant weight in my chest that grew heavier each time I looked at Clara's trusting face or heard concern in my children's voices. But the guilt was matched by something else, something I couldn't quite name, but that felt like awakening after a long sleep. With Elias, I felt more like myself than I had in years, or perhaps more like the person I might have been if I had made different choices along the way. We were careful to maintain boundaries that neither of us named explicitly. Our meetings were public, our conversations intense, but not romantic, our friendship deep but undefined. Yet there was an undercurrent to everything we did, a recognition that passed between us like a shared secret. When our hands accidentally touched reaching for the same menu, when he placed his palm on my shoulder to emphasize a point, when we stood closer than necessary while waiting for the crosswalk to change, I felt electricity that had nothing to do with accident and everything to do with possibility. One evening, as we sat in his neighborhood bar sharing a drink that had stretched into several, He asked me what I was most afraid of. The question should have sent me retreating behind my usual defenses, but something about the dim lighting and the whiskey and the way he was looking at me made honesty feel possible. I told him I was afraid of waking up in 20 years and realizing I had never really lived. That I had spent my entire life being the person other people needed me to be without ever figuring out who I actually was underneath all those expectations. That I was afraid of dying without ever having been truly known by another human being. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass in his hands, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were bright with something that looked like understanding. He said he was afraid of the same thing, that he had spent so much energy protecting himself from rejection that he had forgotten how to be vulnerable enough for real connection. That his confidence was partly performance, a way of moving through the world that kept him safe, but also kept him alone. We walked home that night through streets that felt charged with possibility and danger. At the train station, when it came time to say goodbye, we stood facing each other longer than necessary, as if neither of us wanted to break whatever spell had settled over the evening. When he finally reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, just a moment of contact that could have been simple friendship, I felt something shift inside my chest, something that had been locked away so long I had forgotten it was there. I rode the train home in a state of suspended animation, watching my reflection in the dark window and trying to recognize the man looking back at me. When I arrived at my station, when I walked through my familiar neighborhood toward the house where Clara was probably already asleep, I felt like I was moving between two different worlds, two different versions of who I might be. The front porch light was on, as always, but instead of feeling welcoming, it felt like a spotlight illuminating the careful performance I would have to give once I walked through that door. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at my house, my life, my careful construction of normalcy, and for the first time in my adult life, I wondered what would happen if I simply chose not to go inside. I did go inside that night, but something had fundamentally changed. I moved through my evening routine like an actor who had forgotten why he was on stage, making the right gestures, but feeling disconnected from their meaning. Clara was already in bed, reading one of her romance novels by the soft light of her bedside lamp. She looked up when I entered, smiled sleepily, asked if everything was all right. I told her everything was fine, kissed her forehead with the mechanical affection of 23 years of marriage, and prepared for another night of lying awake staring at the ceiling. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself replaying every conversation I'd had with Elias, every moment when our eyes had met across a table or our hands had accidentally touched, every instance when I had felt more alive than I had in decades. The weight of what I was feeling, what I had been feeling for weeks now, pressed against my chest like a physical thing, demanding acknowledgement I wasn't sure I was brave enough to give. It was 3 days later when everything finally came undone. Elias had suggested we meet at a small wine bar in his neighborhood, somewhere I had never been and was unlikely to encounter anyone from my carefully compartmentalized life. The place was dimly lit, intimate in a way that made conversation feel like confession, and by the time we had finished our first bottle, the careful boundaries we had maintained were beginning to blur. He was telling me about a project he was working on, something involving design for a small theater company, when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with that directness that always made me feel exposed. He said I looked like I was carrying something heavy, like there was something I needed to say, but couldn't find the words. His observation was so accurate it took my breath away, and I felt the careful facade I had spent my entire adult life maintaining begin to crack. I stared down at my wine glass, at the way the light caught the dark liquid, and felt the words rising in my throat like something that had been trapped there for decades. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might make it more real than I was ready for it to be. I told him I had never said this to anyone, that I had carried it alone for so long I had almost convinced myself it wasn't real, wasn't true, wasn't something that needed to be acknowledged. But sitting there with him, feeling the weight of his attention and the safety of his presence, I finally let the words come. I said I thought I might be gay. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I had studied in secret but never dared to use aloud. I said I had known, probably, for longer than I wanted to admit, but that knowing and accepting were different things entirely. That I had built a life around running from this truth, around being the man everyone expected me to be rather than the man I actually was. Elias didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, I felt panic begin to rise. I started to backtrack, to explain myself, to somehow make the words less dangerous than they felt. But he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, stopping my retreat with the gentlest possible touch. He said he knew, that he had known from the first night on the train, had recognized something in me that I was still learning to recognize in myself. His voice was soft, careful, as if he understood that this moment was fragile and could shatter if handled roughly. He said he had been waiting, not pushing, because some truths could only be spoken when we were ready to hear ourselves say them. The contact of his hand on mine was electric, but different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't about desire, exactly, though desire was certainly part of it. It was about recognition, about being seen and known and accepted for who I actually was rather than who I pretended to be. It was about the relief of finally stopping the performance that had exhausted me for decades. When he suggested we go back to his apartment, I should have said no. Should have remembered Clara sleeping in our bed, my children who trusted me, the life I had built that depended on my silence. Instead, I heard myself saying yes, felt myself standing up from the table, walking beside him through streets that felt charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. His apartment was small but warm, filled with the kind of personal touches that spoke to someone living authentically. Books stacked everywhere, artwork from friends, photographs of trips and people I didn't recognize, but who looked happy, unguarded. It was the home of someone who didn't have to hide pieces of himself behind acceptable facades, and I felt both envious and grateful to be invited into that honesty. We sat on his couch, and the conversation continued, but quieter now, more intimate. He told me about his first relationship, about the terror and joy of finally admitting who he was, about the family members who had struggled to accept him and the friends who had embraced him without question. I told him about the books I hid, about the dreams I had abandoned, about the feeling that I had been living underwater for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. When the tears came, they surprised me. I hadn't cried in years, had trained myself out of that kind of vulnerability so thoroughly that I thought I had lost the capacity entirely. But sitting there, finally speaking truths I had carried alone for decades, I felt something break open inside my chest, and the tears came like a dam finally giving way. Elias didn't try to stop them or comfort them away. He simply moved closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, and waited. When I finally looked up at him, his eyes were bright with understanding and something that looked like tenderness. He said I wasn't broken, that wanting love, needing connection, being drawn to someone who understood me didn't make me wrong or damaged or less than. That I had spent so much energy fighting who I was that I had forgotten it might be possible to simply accept it instead. When he leaned forward and kissed me, it was the gentlest thing I had ever experienced. Not demanding or urgent, but patient, careful, as if he understood that this moment carried the weight of everything I had denied myself for 47 years. His lips were soft, his touch reverent, and I felt decades of resistance finally giving way to something that felt like coming home. I kissed him back with all the hunger and fear and longing I had been carrying, and when we finally broke apart, I was trembling, not from shame or regret, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being known by another human being, of being seen completely and not found wanting. We held each other there on his couch as the city grew quiet around us, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The weight I had been carrying for so long had lifted, replaced by something lighter but no less profound. I was still married, still had a life waiting for me across town, still faced impossible choices I wasn't ready to make. But in that moment, wrapped in Elias's arms, I allowed myself to simply exist as I was, without apology or explanation or the crushing need to be someone else. When I finally left his apartment in the early hours of the morning, I walked through empty streets feeling like I was seeing the world for the first time. Everything looked different somehow, sharper and more real, as if admitting the truth had brought everything else into focus. I was terrified of what came next, of the conversations I would have to have and the life I would have to rebuild. But I was also, for the first time in decades, genuinely alive. The facade I had maintained for decades began to crumble in ways I couldn't control. What I thought I could compartmentalize, keep separate from my family life, started bleeding into everything I did. Clara began watching me with different eyes, the trusting acceptance I had grown accustomed to replaced by something more searching, more concerned. She noticed how I startled when my phone buzzed during dinner, how I guarded it more carefully than I ever had before. She commented on my distraction during conversations, the way I seemed to be somewhere else even when I was sitting right beside her. When she asked who I had been texting so much lately, I told her it was work, always work, but I could see she didn't quite believe me anymore. The lies were becoming harder to maintain. I had never been particularly good at deception, had built my life around routines and predictability partly because they didn't require me to remember false stories or keep track of contradictions. But now I found myself creating elaborate explanations for my absences, inventing client meetings and project deadlines that didn't exist, all to protect the few hours a week I spent with Elias. At the office, my colleagues began to notice my distraction. I missed deadlines that should have been simple to meet, lost track of conversations mid-sentence, found myself staring out windows during meetings while my mind wandered to late-night conversations in dimly lit bars. My assistant asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed to see a doctor, if the stress of the Henderson account was getting to me. But it wasn't stress making me unable to concentrate. It was the opposite of stress. For the first time in my adult life, I felt fully awake, fully present in my own skin, and the contrast with the numbness I had accepted as normal was jarring. Every moment spent pretending to be the man I had always been felt like a betrayal of the person I was finally becoming. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late October. I had stayed late at the office again, not to work, but to meet Elias for what had become our regular Tuesday walk along the river. We had talked about everything and nothing, about books and music and the way autumn light looked different in the city than it did in the suburbs. When I finally came home, Clara was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had grown cold while she sat there. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see immediately that something had shifted. The careful politeness that had characterized our interactions for weeks was gone, replaced by something more direct, more dangerous. She asked me to sit down, and the tone of her voice made it clear this wasn't a request. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Clara didn't accuse or demand or cry. She simply spoke with a clarity that cut through all my careful explanations and forced me to face what we both already knew. She said I had been disappearing, piece by piece, for months. That whoever I was becoming was someone she didn't recognize, someone who couldn't quite meet her eyes anymore. She asked me directly if there was someone else. The question hung in the air between us like something sharp and fragile, and I felt all my practiced responses desert me. I couldn't lie to her anymore, couldn't manufacture another excuse or deflection. The weight of everything I had been hiding pressed against my chest until I thought I might suffocate. I told her yes. Not the whole truth, not yet, but enough truth to change everything between us forever. I said there was someone else, someone who made me feel like a different person, someone who saw parts of me I had forgotten existed. I said I was sorry, that I had never meant for it to happen, that I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling without destroying everything we had built together. Clara received this confession with a stillness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and then asked the question I had been dreading most. She asked if I loved him. The pronoun hung in the air between us, and I realized she had known more than she had let on, had perhaps been putting pieces together longer than I had given her credit for. When I couldn't immediately answer, When I sat there struggling with words that felt too large and too dangerous, she nodded again, and I saw something break behind her eyes. The silence that followed was different from any we had shared before. Not the comfortable quiet of long marriage, but something hollow and absolute. The kind of silence that comes after something irreparable has been said. We sat at our kitchen table, in the house we had chosen together, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 23 years of shared life, and felt the distance between us expand until it seemed unbridgeable. When our children came home that weekend, they sensed the change immediately. Michael, home from college for a brief visit, asked why we seemed so formal with each other, why Dad was sleeping in the guest room, why Mom looked like she had been crying. Sarah, 17 and still living at home, retreated to her room and emerged only for meals that felt like elaborate performances of normalcy. I wanted to explain to them, to find words that would make sense of what was happening to our family. But how could I tell them that their father was discovering himself at 47, that the man they had known their entire lives was only part of the story? How could I explain that loving them completely hadn't been enough to make me whole? That authenticity sometimes required breaking things that seemed unbreakable. Michael confronted me directly, asked if we were getting divorced, if there was someone else, if this was why I had been so distant during our phone calls. I told him I didn't know what was going to happen, that I was trying to figure out how to be honest without hurting the people I loved most. He looked at me with a confusion that aged him years in a moment, and I realized I was asking my children to watch their father become a stranger. Sarah's reaction was different, but equally painful. She stopped talking to me almost entirely, responding to my attempts at conversation with monosyllables and avoiding eye contact. When Clara gently suggested she might want to talk to someone about what was happening in our family, Sarah exploded with the kind of adolescent fury that cuts deeper than any adult anger. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this to them, why I couldn't just be normal, why I had to destroy everything that felt safe in her life. Her words were cruel the way only teenage honesty can be cruel, and they hit their target with devastating accuracy. I was destroying their sense of safety, upending the stable foundation they had built their own identities on. Through all of this upheaval, Elias remained patient in a way that humbled me. He didn't pressure me to make decisions I wasn't ready for, didn't demand that I choose him over my family, didn't make ultimatums about what our relationship could or should become. Instead, he simply continued to be present, to offer the kind of understanding that allowed me to think clearly about impossible choices. When I told him about the conversation with Clara, about my children's reactions, about the way my carefully constructed life was falling apart, he listened without trying to fix or solve or persuade. He said he understood that loving someone sometimes meant giving them space to figure out what love actually meant to them. But even without pressure from him, the unspoken question hung between us with increasing urgency. I could continue living in the shadows, maintaining a marriage that had become a performance, protecting my children from a truth they would have to face eventually. Or I could step into the light of who I actually was, knowing that authenticity would cost me everything I had thought I wanted from life. The choice felt impossible because both options required sacrificing something essential. Staying meant betraying the self I had finally found the courage to acknowledge. Leaving meant destroying the family I genuinely loved, even if I hadn't loved them in the way they deserved. I found myself standing at the edge of a life I had never imagined possible, terrified of jumping, but equally terrified of stepping back from the precipice. Everything I had believed about myself, about what constituted a good life, about what I owed to the people who depended on me, was being rewritten in real time. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't continue living in the space between truth and fiction indefinitely. Something would have to give, and soon. The weight of carrying two lives was becoming unbearable, and I could feel myself approaching the moment when I would have to choose which version of myself deserved to survive. I am sitting at my kitchen table in the half-light of dawn, watching the world slowly emerge from darkness outside the window I opened sometime during the night. The birds have begun their morning chorus, a sound I haven't really listened to in years, and there is something almost musical about the way their voices layer over each other, creating harmonies I never noticed when I was rushing through my morning routines. Clara is asleep in the guest room upstairs. She moved there 3 nights ago, after our final conversation, the one where all the careful words we had been using finally gave way to raw honesty. We didn't fight, didn't scream, or throw accusations. We simply acknowledged what we both already knew but had been too frightened to say aloud. Our marriage, whatever it had been, was over. Not because we didn't love each other, but because the kind of love we had shared wasn't enough to sustain a life built on fundamental dishonesty. On the table in front of me sits my wedding ring, the band of gold that has circled my finger for 23 years. I removed it last night, not in anger, but in recognition that continuing to wear it would be another kind of lie. Beside it lies a letter I have written and rewritten dozens of times, addressed to Clara in handwriting that looks strange to me now, more careful than usual, as if I was afraid the words might escape if I didn't hold them down firmly to the page. The letter isn't a goodbye, exactly. It's something harder to name than that. An apology for the years of distance, for the ways I loved her while hiding essential parts of myself, for asking her to build a life with someone who was only partially present. It's also a love letter of sorts, an acknowledgement that she deserved better than what I was able to give her, and a promise that I would do everything in my power to make the dissolution of our life together as gentle as possible. I don't know what comes next. The practical questions feel overwhelming when I let myself think about them directly. Lawyers and paperwork and dividing possessions that were once shared dreams. Explaining to extended family and neighbors and colleagues why the hearts, who seemed so stable for so long, are suddenly coming apart. Learning how to be a divorced father, how to maintain relationships with my children from a distance I have created. Michael called yesterday, his voice careful in the way it gets when he's trying to manage a situation he doesn't understand. He said he wanted to visit again soon, that he and Sarah were worried about both of us, that they needed to know we would all find ways to be okay. I promised him we would, though I'm not sure what okay means anymore for any of us. Sarah has been avoiding me more than usual, which is saying something for a 17-year-old who is already pulling away in the natural way teenagers do. When we pass each other in the hallway, she looks at me like I'm a stranger who happens to share her last name. I understand her anger, even respect it. I have disrupted the fundamental assumptions of her world at an age when everything already feels uncertain. But beneath their confusion and hurt, I think my children are also relieved in ways they might not be able to articulate yet. The tension that has filled our house for months has finally broken, replaced by something clearer, if not easier. The careful performances we were all giving are no longer necessary. Whatever comes next will at least be honest. Elias and I have talked about the future, though neither of us pretends to know what it looks like. He has been patient with my need to move slowly, to untangle one relationship before fully committing to another. He understands that authenticity is a practice I'm still learning, that after decades of hiding, I need time to figure out how to live honestly without destroying everything in my path. We are taking things one day at a time, one conversation at a time, learning how to be together without the weight of secrecy. There is no rush, no pressure to define what we are or where we're going. For now, it's enough to know that I can be myself with him completely, that I don't have to edit or perform or pretend to be someone I'm not. The light outside is growing stronger now, painting the familiar landscape of my neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. In a few hours, this kitchen will fill with the normal sounds of morning routines, though they will be different now. Clara will make coffee for one instead of two. I will eat breakfast alone, or perhaps not at all, before driving to an apartment I have rented across town, a small space that will become my first home as the person I actually am. I breathe deeply, feeling my chest rise and fall in a rhythm that feels natural for the first time in years. The weight I have carried for so long has lifted, replaced by something lighter but no less significant. I am afraid of what comes next, terrified of the ways my choices will continue to ripple through the lives of people I love. But I am also, finally, no longer suffocating under the burden of silence. There will be difficult conversations ahead, painful moments of adjustment, times when I question whether honesty was worth the cost. But sitting here in the quiet of this morning, feeling the possibility of an authentic life stretching out before me, I know I cannot go back to pretending. Whatever the price of truth, the cost of continuing to live a lie would have been higher. I stand up from the table, leaving the ring and the letter where they are for Clara to find when she comes downstairs. I walk to the front door, the same door I have walked through thousands of times, and place my hand on the handle. I don't open it yet. Don't step outside into whatever comes next. But for the first time in my adult life, I'm not afraid to.